A student in a Virginia public school is in the middle of an assignment when some of her classmates object to using AI on the grounds that it's bad for the environment. A teacher in a professional learning session tells her colleagues she's hesitant to use a classroom AI tool for the same reason. And a high school senior in California writes a piece for her school's section of the LA Times saying, and this is a direct quote, "There is always a price to pay for innovation." The objection is showing up. It's not coming from where you might expect, and it's tracking real numbers. Last year, U.S. data centers cost an estimated $25 billion in pollution and health damages. So the question for us today in this podcast is, when a student raises this in your classroom, what do you say? Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Cogan-Drew, and transparently, I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So today's episode is about a question that's starting to come up in classrooms and in teacher professional learning, students and teachers refusing to use AI tools because of their environmental cost. We're going to take a look at what's driving the objection, what the precedent is for this kind of refusal in schools, and what teachers, instructional coaches, and district leaders should actually do when it lands in front of them. So let's get into it. I want to start with three things I've heard or read in the last few weeks. The first is from a colleague here at Newsella. She told me about a customer whose daughter is in a Virginia public school. Some of the students in her class declined to participate in an AI assignment because of its impact on the environment. Not all of them, and not none of them, but some. The second is from another colleague. She told me that participants in her professional learning sessions have said that they're hesitant to use one of our tools that makes use of AI because they cited environmental impact as the reason of their concerns. And then the third is a piece in the LA Times High School Insider section. Two named high school students on the record talking about why AI's environmental footprint concerns them. One of them, Julia Godinich, said that the demand for cheap energy to power AI data centers could set back progress on decarbonizing the grid. The other student, Maithreyi Astagiri, said simply, "There is always a price to pay for innovation." Now, three anecdotes is not a movement, but here's why I think it's worth taking this issue seriously. The numbers behind the objection are real. A Carnegie Mellon economist named Nicholas Mueller analyzed about 2,800 U.S. data centers and estimated their pollution and health-related damages at about $25 billion in 2025. That figure was reported by U.S. News, drawing on federal energy and environmental data. 11 states have proposed legislation since late 2025 to restrict or ban new data center development. And in Virginia, which hosts more data centers than any other state, voter comfort with new data center construction dropped from 69% in 2023 to 35% this past March, according to a Washington Post poll. That's an enormous shift in only 2 years. Now, a quick note on sourcing that the Mueller analysis is describing in U.S. News reporting is an analysis using existing federal data. It has not gone through peer review as far as I'm aware. But the direction of the numbers is corroborated by other reporting, including from the International Energy Agency, which estimates that global data center energy use has grown about 12% a year for the last 5 years. So when a student raises the environmental objection in your classroom, they're not parodying talking points. They're actually tracking a story that the adult press has been covering all year. So that brings us to the question we open with. What do you do? So for context, this is not the first time American students have refused to use classroom materials on ethical grounds. There's a precedent here that I think is worth considering and may be helpful. In 1987, a California high school student named Jennifer Graham refused to dissect a frog in biology class. She objected on ethical grounds. The school initially treated it as a discipline problem. Her case eventually led in 1988 to the first state law giving students the right to opt out of dissection. Now, about 20 states have some form of dissection choice policy. Schools resolve the objection by offering alternative assignments: digital dissection, models, observation, which is to say the pedagogy adapted around the student's refusal. Now, that's not the only example. In the 2000s, students and teachers pushed back on paper-heavy assignments, single-sided printing, all of that on environmental grounds. And that reshaped some procurement practices as well as IT defaults in printing settings, for example. And that drew the issue up from the assignment level. Then there's another example of the United States Against Sweatshops movement, which pushed schools to change their apparel sourcing. And more recently, there's been fossil fuel divestment activism at universities. So the pattern that I see across all of these cases, when students raise ethical objections to classroom materials, the objection rarely stays at the assignment level. There's 3 places it tends to resolve. 1, as an individual opt-out. 2, as a procurement and infrastructure decision. Or 3, as an institutional posture. So right now, the environmental objection against AI is sitting at the assignment level. A student in a classroom, teacher in a PL session. My bet is it won't stay there. Let's talk about, from that perspective, what those working in classrooms can do. So let's start with classroom teachers. My advice, when a student raises this objection, I would say that the worst response is just to dismiss it out of hand and to say, that's not what we're discussing today. That's something I might have said in my earliest days of teaching because I was so focused on my lesson, I didn't want to be distracted by something I hadn't anticipated. I would say the second worst is to push back with a vendor sustainability claim, and we'll talk about what that is in a minute. But the reason that neither of those works is that neither one really responds to the student's concern or engages them. Instead, the move I'd recommend is what you would already do if you had a conscientious objection. You take it seriously. You name what's known and what isn't, and then you ask yourself a question about the assignment. Does this assignment require AI, or does it use AI among one path, but there are other paths that are alternatives? Now, if there are alternatives, then the student can choose one of those, and it's really more of an opt-out. If the assignment requires AI, then the student's objection is worth thinking about and considering whether that assignment design is absolutely necessary to include AI. From an instructional coach's perspective, I think helping teachers recognize whether they're looking at an opt-out conversation or an assignment design conversation is a very good role for an instructional coach to play. Not every objection demands accommodation, but understanding what the objections are tells you something about how the assignment is being received. And for district leaders, I think there's an interesting lens here. This is where you can look back at some of the precedent and think about the implications for procurement. There's something interesting about data centers that's a little different than some of the other infrastructure and industrial projects that enter into communities. Normally, when a community hosts a factory, the community gets jobs and the tax base in return for the disruption. But data centers don't work that way. The computing power is serving people far away, and the local community absorbs the water, the power demand, the air quality costs, and the benefits that are accrued through this investment are not for the local population. And I think that's why public opinion is shifting so fast. It's because this social contract doesn't apply. And I think if you're a district leader, you need to be aware of the practical implications of this dynamic, because a community like yours that's under pressure from data center growth that may be nearby and could also disproportionately include lower income districts and rural areas are going to bring that pressure into school board conversations. And that could have implications for your procurement policies. And that's a point being made recently in the Ed Week market brief, that New York City's AI guidance has already started pivoting towards sustainability criteria in vendor procurement. And I think that's a direction to pay attention to, because I think that's a trend that will continue to build. It's worth knowing that from the vendor perspective, vendors are starting to respond. For example, Brisk, an edtech AI company many of you may know, recently published a blog announcing it had purchased water restoration certificates covering more than twice its estimated water footprint with third-party verification. Now, to Brisk's credit, they explicitly say it doesn't balance their full impact, and they call it just a starting point. I'd say that's more honest than the genre standard for sustainability claims. So good on them. There's one last thing the dissection precedent teaches us, that when schools resolved that objection, they didn't tell the student that the harm had been offset. They changed what the assignment required. So this offsetting dynamic is fundamentally different than opting out. It's worth holding in mind the distinction if this conversation moves into your district. So we'd love to know, speaking of conversations in your district, what is that conversation? Has a student raised this objection in a classroom? Have you had this objection in a professional learning setting? What does the conversation look and sound like in board meetings? If you had the ability to tell your district what to do if something like this came to a board meeting, what would you say? Please share your stories. We'd love to know what the reality is on the ground. Thanks as always for joining, and we'll see you next time.